The glittering skyline of Manhattan sparkled like 1,000 diamonds against the twilight sky. From the penthouse of the Ashford Tower, 30-year-old Victoria Ashford gazed out at her family's empire with a glass of champagne dangling between her manicured fingers. The Ashford name adorned half the buildings visible from her window. Hospitals, universities, corporate headquarters, a legacy built by her grandfather and expanded by her father. Victoria sighed, setting down her untouched champagne. Tomorrow's headline in the society pages would announce her engagement to Bradley Wellington, heir to the Wellington banking fortune. A merger of dynasties that would create the largest private wealth conglomerate on the East Coast. The only problem? Victoria had never met Bradley. The arrangement, orchestrated by her father, was purely business. "Miss Ashford, your father is on line 1." Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Tell him I'm unavailable. He says it's regarding tomorrow's announcement." Of course it was. Victoria picked up the phone, bracing herself. "Victoria, darling," her father's authoritative voice boomed through the speaker. "The Wellingtons are expecting you at brunch tomorrow. I trust you'll be properly prepared." Victoria closed her eyes. "Father, I've been thinking." "Not this again," he cut her off. "The board meeting is next month. This merger secures your position as future CEO. Unless you'd prefer I consider your cousin Richard instead." The threat wasn't subtle. Victoria had worked her entire life to prove herself worthy of taking over Ashford Industries. Richard, her father's nephew, had been angling for the position despite having half her qualifications and twice her entitlement. "I'll be there," she conceded. After hanging up, Victoria grabbed her coat and slipped past her security detail. She needed air, needed to feel something real before surrendering to a lifetime of corporate obligation disguised as marriage. The autumn air bit at her cheeks as she walked aimlessly through the city streets, venturing farther from the polished avenues of Upper Manhattan than she had in years. As light rain began to fall, Victoria ducked into a small coffee shop in a neighborhood her driver would never take her through. That's when she saw him. A man in his early 30s sitting at a corner table, intensely focused on a worn notebook, seemingly oblivious to his frayed clothes and the suspicious glances from other patrons. There was something in his expression, a quiet dignity, an independence that Victoria instantly envied. Little did she know that this chance encounter would completely upend both their lives and challenge everything she thought she knew about wealth, worth, and what it truly means to be free. Music swells. The man's name was Elijah Carter. Once a promising architectural student, his life had unraveled 3 years ago after his mother's prolonged illness drained his savings and cost him his apartment. Now he moved between shelters and the occasional cheap hostel when he could afford it, working odd jobs while continuing to sketch building designs in his notebook. "Mind if I sit here?" Victoria asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Elijah glanced up, his initial wariness giving way to curiosity. "Free country," he replied with a shrug, closing his notebook. Victoria noticed the architectural sketches before he could hide them. "Those are remarkable," she said. "The cantilever design on that high-rise, it's innovative." Surprise flickered across his face. "You know architecture?" "My family's business," she said vaguely, not wanting to reveal her identity. "I'm Victoria." "Elijah. And this," he gestured to his coffee, "is my daily splurge." Over the next hour, Victoria found herself more engaged in conversation than she had been in years. Elijah spoke passionately about sustainable urban development and creating affordable housing that maintained dignity and beauty, ironically, the very things he currently lacked. "So what's your story?" he finally asked. "You're clearly not from this neighborhood." Victoria hesitated. "I'm trapped. Tomorrow I'm being engaged to a man I've never met because it's good for business." Elijah let out a low whistle. "Sounds medieval." "It's my reality," she said quietly. When the coffee shop closed, Victoria was shocked to realize 3 hours had passed. Standing in the rain, she impulsively said, "I want to hire you." Elijah's face hardened. "I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity. I need a date. For an event tomorrow. Someone who will horrify my father and the entire board of directors." The plan forming in Victoria's mind was reckless, possibly insane, but for the first time in years she felt alive. Elijah studied her, then laughed. You want to rent a homeless guy to scandalize your rich family. That's either the most offensive or most honest job offer I've ever had. It's more than that, Victoria said, the idea crystallizing. I need a fiancé. A fake one. Just long enough to force my father to cancel the merger and give me time to prove I can run the company without marrying into another dynasty. And you picked me because you're brilliant, you're real, and you understand architecture better than most of the designers my company employs, she said honestly. Also, you clearly need the money, and I'm willing to pay very well. Elijah's expression was unreadable. How well? $100,000, an apartment for 6 months, and introductions to the top architectural firms in the city once our engagement ends. The rain fell harder as Elijah considered her offer. This is crazy, he finally said. Is that a yes? Victoria asked. You're either the most interesting woman I've ever met or completely insane, he replied with a hint of a smile. But yes. The next morning, Victoria's personal stylist and team of assistants transformed Elijah. The transformation wasn't just external clothes and a haircut, but in how he carried himself as Victoria briefed him on the world he was about to enter. Remember, you're not playing a role so much as being yourself, just with a backstory we've created, Victoria explained as her driver took them to the Wellington estate. The more authentic you are, the more it will drive my father crazy. Elijah adjusted his tie nervously. What happens when he investigates me? He will, you know. Victoria smiled. I'm counting on it. By the time he discovers who you really are, the Wellington merger will be off the table, and I'll have leverage to negotiate my own terms. What Victoria didn't say was how much she had enjoyed their conversations the previous day, or how refreshing his honesty was after a lifetime of calculated social interactions. For the first time, she was working with someone who had nothing to gain beyond what they'd agreed upon: no family connections to exploit, no corporate secrets to steal. As they pulled up to the imposing Wellington estate, Victoria squeezed Elijah's hand, ready to become the most talked-about couple in Manhattan. Elijah looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. I should be asking you that. You're the one with everything to lose. Victoria's laugh held a touch of rebellion, or everything to gain. Music transitions. The Wellington brunch was exactly as Victoria had anticipated, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth designed to intimidate and impress. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, rare orchids adorned every table, and staff outnumbered guests 2 to 1. Victoria's entrance with Elijah created exactly the stir she'd hoped for. Her father, Charles Ashford, a formidable man with silver hair and cold eyes, froze mid-conversation. The Wellington patriarch, equally stunned, nearly dropped his mimosa. Charles recovered quickly, striding over with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. We were expecting you alone. Change of plans, Father, Victoria replied sweetly. I'd like you to meet my fiancé, Elijah Carter. The silence that followed was so complete that Victoria could hear the clink of silverware from the kitchen. Her father's face flushed an alarming shade of red. You're what? He managed. Fiancé, Victoria repeated. We're in love. It's all very sudden, I know, but when it's right, it's right. She beamed at Elijah, who played his part perfectly, offering his hand to Charles. It's an honor to meet you, Sir, Elijah said with genuine respect that somehow made the situation even more disarming. Victoria speaks very highly of you. Charles ignored the outstretched hand. Victoria, a word. Now. In the Wellington's wood-paneled study, Charles exploded. Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what you've done? The Wellingtons are humiliated. I can't marry someone I don't know or love, Victoria stated firmly. Love, Charles scoffed. You think this company was built on love? It was built on strategic decisions and sacrifices. Maybe that's why Mother left, Victoria said quietly. The comment hit its mark. Charles stiffened. You have responsibilities, Victoria, a legacy to uphold. I can uphold it my way. I've developed a proposal for expanding into sustainable urban development. The profit margins. This isn't about business, he cut her off. It's about your rebellion. Who is this man? Where did you find him? Victoria smiled. Why don't you investigate him? You will anyway. Returning to the brunch, Victoria found Elijah engaged in conversation with a group of younger guests, explaining a concept for vertical urban gardens with surprising authority. She realized she had underestimated him in this setting. He wasn't just playing a part, his intelligence and vision were shining through despite his background. Over the next few weeks, Victoria and Elijah maintained their charade in public while she worked frantically behind the scenes on her business proposal. To maintain appearances, Elijah moved into her guest suite, and they established a comfortable routine. During the day, she worked while he used her home office to develop his architectural portfolio. In the evenings, they attended society events where Elijah charmed people, despite or perhaps because of his unfiltered honesty. "You're enjoying this too much," Victoria accused one night as they returned from a charity gala where Elijah had inadvertently offended and then thoroughly impressed the mayor with his ideas on urban renewal. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "I'm enjoying it too." What neither of them had anticipated was how their pretend relationship would evolve in private. Late-night conversations about their dreams, fears, and pasts created a bond that became increasingly difficult to label as merely transactional. "Why architecture?" Victoria asked one evening as they shared takeout on her balcony. Elijah's expression softened. "My mother was a housekeeper for wealthy families. I saw how spaces affected people, how the servants' quarters were designed to make people feel small, while the main houses elevated their owners. I wanted to design spaces that honored everyone who lived or worked in them." Victoria thought about the Ashford Tower, with its separate elevators and entrances for service staff. "I never considered that," she admitted. "Most people born into privilege don't have to," he said without judgment. "It's not a character flaw, just a blind spot." Their conversations forced Victoria to examine aspects of her world she'd always taken for granted, while Elijah gained insight into the complexities and pressures of her position. As predicted, Charles Ashford launched a thorough investigation into Elijah's background. 6 weeks into their arrangement, he summoned Victoria to his office, slapping a file onto his desk. "Architectural dropout. Homeless. Working odd jobs," he listed disgustedly. "Is this some kind of joke?" Victoria maintained her composure. "Did your investigators also discover his perfect GPA before his mother's illness? Or his design that won the Hayworth student competition?" Charles looked startled. "This isn't about his credentials. It's about you making a mockery of our family name." "No, father. It's about you refusing to see me as anything but an asset to be leveraged," Victoria countered. "The Wellington merger is off the table. I'm presenting my sustainable development initiative to the board next week. Judge me on my work, not my marital status." That evening, Victoria returned home to find Elijah packing. "Your father's men approached me today," he explained. "Offered me $500,000 to disappear." Victoria felt her heart drop. "What did you say?" "I told them our arrangement wasn't with them," he replied. "But Victoria, this was always temporary. Your father knows the truth now. You don't need me anymore." Victoria realized with sudden clarity that she did need him not for her plan, which had succeeded, but for how he challenged her, made her laugh, made her see the world differently. "The deal was 6 months," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I keep my promises." Elijah studied her. "This isn't about the deal anymore, is it?" Before she could answer, her phone rang. Her assistant, panicking. Someone had leaked Elijah's background to the press. The story was breaking: billionaire heiress buys a homeless man to be her fiancé. Dramatic music crescendo. The media frenzy was immediate and vicious. Headlines screamed about Victoria's charity case Fiancée and speculated about her mental state. Business publications questioned her judgment and fitness to lead. Paparazzi camped outside her building, forcing them to remain inside. "I'm so sorry," Victoria said, watching Elijah read yet another brutal article. "I never meant for this to happen." "I knew what I was getting into," he replied, though his tight expression suggested otherwise. Victoria's phone rang constantly. Her father, board members, PR consultants, all demanding she end the engagement immediately and issue a statement explaining it had been a momentary lapse in judgment. "Maybe they're right," she said after a particularly difficult call with the company's largest shareholder. "Maybe I should just tell the truth." "Which truth?" Elijah asked quietly. "That you hired me? Or that somewhere along the way, this stopped being pretend for both of us?" The question hung between them, neither ready to answer it directly. The next morning, Victoria awoke to find Elijah gone, leaving only a note, "I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for." Devastated but resolute, Victoria prepared for her board presentation. Without Elijah's support, the pitch she had been so confident about now felt hollow. Still, she arrived at Ashford headquarters determined to fight for her vision, both for the company and for herself. As she walked through the executive floor, heads turned and whispers followed. The boardroom fell silent when she entered. Her father sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Victoria," he began formally, "in light of recent events, the board has concerns about my judgment," she finished for him. "Let me address that directly." Taking a deep breath, Victoria abandoned her prepared presentation. "Yes, I met Elijah Carter when he was homeless. No, our engagement didn't begin conventionally. But working with him showed me what Ashford Industries has lost sight of, that success isn't just measured in acquisitions and profit margins, but..." She turned to the large windows overlooking the city. "Look at our skyline. We've built monuments to wealth that exclude most of the people who make this city function. My proposal isn't just about sustainable development, it's about reimagining what our company stands for." Victoria projected images of Elijah's designs: efficient, beautiful, accessible spaces where people of all income levels could live with dignity. "This is innovation," she continued. "Not merging with another dynasty to consolidate power, but using our resources to address real problems while still turning a profit. The data supporting this approach is in your packets." The room remained silent as board members reviewed the meticulously prepared financial projections. "And what about Mr. Carter?" one board member finally asked. "Was he just a prop in this vision of yours?" The question struck at Victoria's deepest regret. "Elijah Carter is the most authentic person I've ever known," she answered honestly. "He showed me what it means to build something meaningful. If that makes me unfit to lead this company, so be it." To her surprise, her father stood. 25 years ago, I drove your mother away because I couldn't see beyond traditions and expectations," he said, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. "I've spent decades building wealth while losing what matters most. I won't make the same mistake with you." He turned to the board. "My daughter has presented a viable business strategy that aligns with market trends toward sustainability while maintaining profitability. I move to approve her proposal and her appointment as CEO, effective immediately." The board's vote wasn't unanimous, but it was sufficient. As the meeting adjourned, Charles approached Victoria. "You found someone who makes you see the world differently," he said quietly. "Don't let him go." But Victoria had no idea where Elijah had gone. He'd withdrawn the money she'd already paid him and disappeared. Her private investigators found nothing. It seemed Elijah didn't want to be found. Reflective music plays softly 3 months later. Victoria stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for Ashford Community Development's first project, an innovative mixed-income housing complex designed to bring together people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds while revitalizing a struggling neighborhood. The press coverage had gradually shifted from scandal to genuine interest in her vision for urban renewal. Though she smiled for the cameras as she drove the ceremonial shovel into the ground, Victoria felt Elijah's absence acutely. The building's design incorporated many of his ideas, though she'd hired another firm to execute the final plans. After the ceremony, Victoria visited the small coffee shop where they'd first met. She'd made it a habit to stop by occasionally, hoping against hope that he might return. The barista recognized her now, but only offered a sympathetic smile. No, he hadn't been in. Victoria settled at what she thought of as their table when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Check your email." Her heart racing, Victoria opened her inbox to find a message containing only a set of coordinates and a time: 7 p.m. tonight. The coordinates led to a community garden on the Lower East Side, one of the few green spaces in an otherwise concrete neighborhood. As Victoria approached, she saw a small gathering of people around a table with architectural models. And there was Elijah, pointing out features of a design to an attentive audience. He looked different, healthier, more confident, wearing clothes that fit properly, but his passionate gesturing as he explained his vision was unmistakable. He spotted her and paused mid-sentence. The group turned to see what had distracted him, murmurs of recognition spreading as they identified Victoria. "Sorry, folks, we'll continue this community feedback session in a few minutes," Elijah said, walking toward Victoria. They stood facing each other, months of unspoken words hanging between them. "You're hard to find," Victoria finally said. "I needed time," he replied, "to figure out who I am without the arrangement." Victoria nodded toward the architectural models. "What is this place?" "My new job," Elijah explained. "I'm working with a non-profit urban development group. We're designing community spaces in underserved neighborhoods." "Using your Ashford payoff?" she asked with a hint of hurt. "Using the first genuine opportunity I've had in years," he corrected gently. "I donated most of the money to homelessness prevention programs, kept just enough to get back on my feet." Victoria looked around at the garden, the community members, the models of thoughtful spaces designed for people society often overlooked. "You're doing what you always wanted to do." "So are you," he said. "I've been following your work. The Ashford Community Development Initiative it's everything we talked about." "It's missing something," Victoria admitted. "It's missing you." Elijah's expression softened. "Victoria, I left because what was happening between us was real, and I couldn't build something real on a foundation of pretense." "Then let's start over," she suggested. "No arrangements, no pretending, just two people who see the world differently together than they do apart." "The billionaire heiress and the formerly homeless architect?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. "Sounds like a headline." "I don't care about headlines anymore," Victoria said. "I care about building something meaningful." "As partners?" Elijah asked. Victoria smiled. "For starters." That evening, as they walked through the city sharing ideas and possibilities, Victoria realized that the arrangement that had begun as a rebellion had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated: a chance to redesign not just buildings or companies, but their own lives according to blueprints they created together. 6 months later, the first Ashford Carter Community Development Project opened its doors. The innovative mixed-use space included affordable housing, community gardens, workspaces for local entrepreneurs, and a coffee shop where the baristas were also part owners. At the opening ceremony, Victoria and Elijah stood side by side, no longer pretending, no longer performing roles assigned by others or circumstances. Their engagement, their real one, had been a private affair, marked not by society announcements but by a simple promise to build a life that honored both their visions. Charles Ashford, who had begun his own journey of transformation, watched with something approaching pride as his daughter cut the ribbon. Later, he approached Elijah. "I judged you unfairly," he admitted. "I saw your circumstances, not your character." "Most people do," Elijah replied without bitterness. "It's why we're designing buildings that make it harder to ignore each other." Victoria, overhearing the exchange, felt a surge of hope not just for her future with Elijah, but for the possibility that people, like buildings and companies, could be redesigned with intention and care. That night, standing on the rooftop garden of their newest development, Victoria marveled at how differently the city looked from this vantage point. Not as a collection of assets or properties, but as a living ecosystem where each person's contribution created the whole. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked, joining her at the railing. "That some arrangements turn into something much more valuable than anyone could have planned," she replied, reaching for his hand. Beneath them, residents were already making the space their own, children playing in the courtyard, neighbors sharing meals, community members planning initiatives, not separate worlds of privilege and need, but one interconnected community. "We did it," Victoria whispered. Elijah smiled. "We're just getting started." Music swells to conclusion. And that's the end of our story today, a reminder that true worth isn't measured by bank accounts or social status, but by the courage to see beyond the world as it is and imagine what it could be. Sometimes the most valuable connections come from the most unexpected places, and the most beautiful designs aren't just for buildings, but for lives built with purpose and understanding.